Okay, so let's get started. So as mentioned, the Infocapture tool, ooh, help if I could type. So Infocapture here, of course, is our form building software. It's a platform that allows you to build a variety of different tools or forms and suited to your needs and your business needs there. You can build a variety of different workflows and implement them within these forms to go through different stages of approval, confirmation, etc. Now, in order to build a new form, we need to make sure that we have admin access to the tool. So we're going to head to the admin panel here, and we're going to head to Infocapture from here. Now, from this perspective, you will see the forms that we just saw a second ago, but this is more from a construction standpoint. So again, this is going to show any of the existing, what are called projects, simply means forms, but for the language in reference to this product, the projects are the different unique forms that you can create. And we can see, of course, there are a variety to choose from. If I wanted to make any changes and adjust any existing ones, I would do so by selecting on them from here. However, on the right-hand side, we can also see there is the option to add a new project, which is, of course, in this terminology, suggesting that we can create a brand new form from scratch. So that's what I'm going to do here. So there are a couple of other options. These are something that we'll potentially cover in a future session to give a bit more understanding, but realistically a brief sort of gloss over. We can see we can import a project that will allow you to attach a Infocapture project from somewhere else. So for instance, we have a variety of templates that you can utilize on Discover itself. You can download those, and using the import function here, you can add them to your own intranet as necessary. All the rules and functionality will be in place, but you can then build upon that, rename it, adjust it, etc. And the system style sheets here is just sort of the design backdrop, if you will, of the form that you've created, allowing you to implement different sort of colors and features to the form if necessary. But as mentioned, for the purpose of today, we're just going to focus on the add a new project side of things. Great. Okay, so here we can see that when it comes to adding a new project, the first thing we're presented with are a variety of fields in order to give some context and information about the form. So the first thing we have here is the project name. And this is simply, of course, the name of the form that we wish to create. It, of course, can be anything, but for the purpose of today, we are going to call this help desk. Let's put it as training, okay? You can see I've done this a few times before, but here we go. So of course, this is defining, this is a help desk form, put it in brackets, of course, this is purely for a training perspective. But realistically, this is the sort of form that you might want to build and utilize a workflow, etc. within here. From here, we then have our project status. And what this is going to allow us to do is define the current sort of functioning level of this particular form. So this, just to clarify, this isn't tied to the statuses that you can implement within your workflow, where you would have approvals, etc. This is purely for the form's current sort of functioning level. So we can see that it defaults to active, but there are two other options to choose from. We have testing and blocked. Testing meaning that this is, of course, something that we are in the process of testing, working out all the kinks, etc. And then blocked is, of course, that this form, I guess this is more of an archive function. So both active and testing, realistically, this could be seen on the front end. You could go through the form, fill out all the different fields and information, whereas blocked will just simply deny that. You can't interact with it. You can only see it from the admin panel like we've done, and then you could move it again to active or testing if necessary. So realistically, look at blocked as like an archive stage there. When it comes to active and testing as well, there isn't too much difference between the overall functionality. There's only one major difference between the two, and that is that when you're in testing, notifications, email alerts, etc., are all disabled. That means you can go through the form, make sure that all of the processes and stages are working without filling and flooding your inbox, if you will, in the process. But that's realistically the only difference between active and testing. But for now, let's move that into testing. We can then see, of course, that we have the icon to represent this form. So as we saw a second ago, if I go back to the front end of Infocapture, each of these forms has a different sort of variety of icons and colors sort of representing what the form is. As we can see from here, this is going to allow us to change that icon and be a bit more representative of this particular form if necessary. So there are a variety of different glyph icons that can be chosen here. Let's pick something like that. And then, of course, we can change the color scheme here as well if we want to. This is purely just, of course, aesthetic. There isn't too much of a major impact to the overall form with this, but it allows us to make changes as necessary. Okay, so there we go. There is our icon. That's what that will look like. We then have a description for the form, okay? And we have 3 different fields to define a description. So the first one here is describe its purpose. We then have short description and then full description. And as it states, this is optional. Realistically, all of them are technically optional. You can see that there is no required fields when it comes to filling out this part of the form, but it is very useful to have a form of description on here. The describe its purpose, this will appear from the admin side, allowing other administrators to get a bit more context of the functionality of this form so they know what they should be doing when making changes or adjustments like so. And then the short description and full description both appear on the front end. So as an example here, if we go to support tickets, we'll be able to see, of course, that this is a description. And this is just, again, intended to give context to the end users, people who will actually be using this form and understanding what they would be gaining and the reason why you maybe want to submit a form using this process. There isn't really too much of a difference between the short and full description. The only major sort of aspect, as you can see with the full description here, it's slightly larger and allows you to use additional functions that a word processor would. So we can bold, bullet points, put links in there, etc. Whereas the short description is purely just text. Further down, we have some additional information. First off, we have our code name. Now, this isn't something that is mandatory, but it's something I would strongly recommend to every form that you create. And as we can see here, it gives a brief description of what a code name is, but it's basically specifying that if this has been specified, the project will have its own unique URL, which will be domain name /forms/ whatever we specify the code name to be. So again, for reference, if we look at the support tickets form, we can see that this is domain name /forms/tickets. So this part has been defined as the code name for this particular form. If you don't add one, it'll just put a ID number, if you will, realistically, and it won't look particularly as nice. That's the only sort of major issue with this. It isn't, you know, hugely negative if you don't apply a code name, but in terms of sort of display and just looking a bit cleaner, it is something that we would strongly recommend implementing. Okay. So I am going to put a code name in here. Funnily enough, this is going to be help desk. We can also implement some tags on here, which will help with searching and fine tuning, trying to filter between particular forms that we've created. And then because there are already some pre-existing forms on this demo site here, we also have this option down below, which is to copy the project from, okay? And as we can see, if I go to this drop down, it's going to show all of the other existing forms currently on the system here. And what this is going to allow me to do is basically copy, as you would expect, the layout and the fields from an existing form and automatically apply them to this. Okay, so this can be very useful when you have a lot of similar forms. Their design is going to be of a similar sort of layout, and the fields will all be very sort of similar in that regard. Copying the projects can make things a lot easier. Now, we also saw the idea of importing a project, the page back. Now, there is a slight difference between copying and importing. One, of course, importing allows you to do it from something off-site, which is a huge important factor. But also, it's worth mentioning that when you are copying a project, it will only bring the shell, if you will, of the form. So it will bring all the fields, the name of those fields, etc. But if you've applied any advanced rules, etc. to it, it shouldn't bring those across. So that's something to bear in mind, the difference between copying and importing as well. For the purpose of this being a brand new form, we're going to leave this completely blank. And we're just going to hit save now and create this as necessary. Okay, perfect. So there we go. So that's the first part of our form, if you will. We've now given it a name. We've given it an icon, I suppose. We haven't given a description to this one, but realistically, that is something you probably would do. But there we go. Now, as we can see at this point, there's this little information telling us that although we've sort of defined the project, we haven't created any content for it. And as it says, you haven't created a form yet. Click on checkout form to add fields to it or set up any of the options using the functions on the left. So this is simply saying that from here, we need to press checkout form in order to start putting pieces together to build the form and create a structure for that. But it's also mentioning that, of course, on the left-hand side, we can see a variety of different options to allow for sort of fine-tuning and tweaks to the form. Now, as I mentioned, in the next session, we'll be covering a bit of these in a bit more detail. But for the purpose of today, we will be covering a couple of these, and that's most importantly, the edit project properties and project permissions. And with that said, I am quickly just going to jump to the edit project properties before we build the form, so we can see some features here. So if I go to this now, we can see, of course, that right now this looks very familiar to what we were just looking at. A couple of fields might have been positioned differently. So again, we have our project name, we have the describing of its purpose, the statuses, the icons, and the descriptions. As we go further down, there are some additional items that have been added here. And some of these have a hugely impactful sort of side of how the form will work and react in the future. So the first thing we can potentially see here is handle incoming mail. What this will allow you to do is implement a form of mail fetching into the form, allowing you to email the form, if you will, fill that information out and then submit a ticket from email. Now, this can be very useful, but it is worth mentioning that, of course, if that method is being used, it can't capture the name of the user who submitted this. And instead of it saying, oh, it's submitted by X user, it will say guest. So it can be very useful in some aspects, but it isn't something I would strongly recommend relying on for all of the forms that you create. Underneath that, we can see, of course, there is this item here as well, which is also very important. So as sorry, the wording, as we can see here, says from address for email notification. And what this is simply specifying is, when it comes to Infocapture, of course, you can send out notifications and alerts to tell people that maybe someone submitted a ticket or it's waiting your approval or confirmation, etc. With that sort of said, these can be configured as an email alert, okay? So you can notify someone by email, informing them of whatever you need in regards to the workflow and process of this form. Now, by default, if this is being sent as email, it will be a default email address that comes from Clarimentis, if you will. And it'll be something like, again, potentially domain name at infocapture.com or something along those lines. I can't remember fully off the top of my head, apologies. But naturally, from an end user perspective, they might not necessarily know that this is called Infocapture, as you could rename it. There's a lot of things that might make this particular email look quite suspicious or confusing. So if that's the case, of course, you have the ability to change where that email is being sent from. And what that will simply allow you to do is, of course, just type in a different email address. It has to be an active email address, so it's something that is working. And then the emails will be sent from there instead. It can be very useful, again, familiarizing and sort of making everything sort of a bit clearer in regards to the creation of, you know, the notifications that you wish to send out, again, based on the type of form that you're creating. Now, underneath that, there are, of course, a couple of other features which are new as well. So we have the assigned field appears, and this is simply just a checkbox to define whether or not, again, based on the type of form that we're creating, if you want to be able to assign this to particular users. Now, again, this can be a very important and powerful feature of Infocapture, but isn't always something that's required. So for context, once more, I'm going to jump to my favorite form, the support tickets one here. And what we'll see is if I open up this, how suspenseful, there we go. We can see, of course, at the very bottom, oh yeah, I made changes to this one, this probably doesn't help. There we go, good. This part, where we can see, of course, that there's this assign to option. And this is going to allow me to pick from a variety of different individual users. I must stress that as well, just to clarify. this can only be assigned to an individual, not an entire department or something like that, but you are assigning it to an individual to be responsible for and potentially looking into this form or this submission. And this assign to option, as mentioned, this will only appear if this checkbox up here has been selected. With that not being defined, you can't assign it to users, and then you can't use one of the permissions, which we'll see in a second, within the functionality of your form. Again, this isn't always going to be required. It is just something that is available to you, depending on the nature of the form, but can be very useful and powerful in certain circumstances. Okay. And then the last sort of additional or new feature from this perspective is the ticket ID prefix. Now, again, this isn't mandatory, but once more, I would strongly recommend applying an ID prefix to every form that you create. And the reason purely for that is because, as it says here, the project tickets will have its own numeration if prefix is set. A bit wordy, but just to give a bit of context of what that is saying is, if we look at this form, again, from the ticket list view, we can see that there is this ID column, okay? And naturally, as you'd expect, the ID goes up every time a ticket's been submitted, because each one needs to be unique and identifiable in that regard. So we can see it starts from, on the other page, it starts from 1, goes up, and we end up at 23, for instance, in that case. Now, you'll also notice at the start of these, it says ST, okay? And that's the ID prefix that has been specified for this support ticket form. If you don't apply an ID prefix, what will happen is there's no way to isolate or pinpoint where the ID number should reside when it comes to your forms. So to give that as sort of an example, let's say that we've created 2 forms, rather creatively called Form A and Form B. Now, neither of these have a prefix set. And let's say a person comes along, they submit a ticket to Form A. Naturally, as you'd expect, the ID number for that will be 0001. Okay, it's the first form, it's the first ticket. 1 is going to, of course, be the ID number for that. Let's say a second person comes along, submits a ticket into Form A as well. Naturally, as you'd expect, the ID number for that will be 0002. Whereas what will then happen, of course, because there is no prefix, let's say a third person comes along, submits a ticket into Form B, even though it's the first ticket that's been submitted into that particular form, because there is no prefix, the system can't identify the uniqueness of those, the ID number will be 0003, okay? So again, it's not a hugely impactful aspect, but in terms of sort of continuity and making sure all of these line up and you're not worried if one's been deleted or missed, etc., it is very, very useful to apply the ID prefix here. Okay, so what I'm going to do, of course, is practice that. And as we can see, for HD, for help desk, and then I'm just going to hit save. Okay, so those are just the additional features in the project properties there. With that sort of done, hopefully that's given a bit more context of some additional aspects to add to the sort of overarching side of the form. But now, as mentioned, we are going to look at actually piecing together the form, building it, and see how that works. So the first and real only option that we have at this time is, of course, to check out the form. And this is going to allow us to then start building this. Now, before I continue, chat seems to have disappeared from me at the moment, which is a bit concerning. But has anyone got any questions at all? Oh, perfect, Karen, thank you. That's a very good point. Let's jump back, actually, because you're right, that wasn't on the original thing. So for people who might not see, Karen has asked a question in reference to, if we go back to the project properties, there is this item down here called the plugin class name. Now, this is a great feature within Infocapture that isn't something that we would call as standard, but hopefully, as we'll see through this call and future ones discussing Infocapture, the tool itself is very flexible. You know, there's a lot of features and sort of customizing aspects to it to make a lot of unique processes within the tool. However, it's not 100, you know, it's not infallible, I suppose. You know, there are some things that it cannot do. One of those, for instance, as an example, is communicating with databases outside of Claromentis. So what we can do is we can create a variety of different plugins for you, which can achieve those features ultimately. It allows us to basically put bolt-ons, if you will, or add-ons to a particular form to give unique functionality and results. So that's what that will allow you to do. As I said, it's not something that someone can manually implement themselves. It's when our custom team there, Karen, creates sort of, as it's called, a plugin for you. We would add it to this aspect, and it would just mean that the form would work in this brand new, unique way. Okay, Jeremy, that's a very good question that you've asked there. So Jeremy has asked me, can the ID prefix be used on an existing project with existing tickets after the fact? So as an example here, they have 1,000 tickets without a prefix, and then they decide to add one. How will that work? And to be honest, that's a good question that I don't necessarily know, Jeremy. One of my colleagues in the call might be able to assist us with that. I would assume that that's just going to retroactively add the ID number to the existing tickets. But Mike Gilly, I think you might be in the call still. Could you potentially help me confirm that? Is that something that's the case?
I don't know, honestly, as well. I've never checked it, but it should be simple enough to check, so I can try that now and get back to you in a few minutes.
Fantastic, thank you, Gilly. But yes, it's a really good question, Jeremy. It's always good having these sort of questions because it's just something I don't consider, and then I get asked it, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's a good point. But thank you very much for that. Okay, are there any other questions from anyone at this time, or should we look at building the form now? Perfect, looking good. All right. Okay, so let's jump back then to the project summary. And as we were going to do, we're going to go to, well, now, of course, because we've started checking out the form, I jumped backwards. Where this originally said checkout form, it's going to say now, continue editing the form fields. So if I go into this now, this is where we were a second ago, and it's simply just the sort of framework, if you will, for building a form in Infocapture. Now, you can see up at the top, there's a variety of different fields that allow you to quickly create and apply these fields to the form to build exactly what you're looking for. So this is going to be quite a simplistic field, simplistic form, I guess, for the purpose of this call. But what we'll do is in the future, we'll build upon this and see how some additional rules and functionality can be applied to this at a later point. But realistically now, we're going to be utilizing a variety of these different fields. I'll explain, of course, all of them, potentially why you might use them. But let's go through those in a second. And my colleague there, Michael Christian, has explained again, hopefully with the plugins. As mentioned, it's there for our developers to create some additional features if necessary.
And I've also just checked the prefix thing. And if you add the prefix when you already have tickets, it will apply the prefix for those.
Oh, fantastic. So yes, it does retroactively fit that. Is that right?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Perfect. All working together, I love it. Okay, so looking at the form then, as I mentioned, there are a variety of different fields on the form here for us to utilize. So the first one here is just add a new field, quite generic, and it's simply just specifying a way to implement any of these other fields to the form. Again, if you're comfortable, you can simply just utilize this, and then this will apply a drop down within the option itself, as you can see like so. And then I can select from all of the different types of fields here, allowing me to implement whatever I wish. However, in terms of just speeding up the process, there are just these shortcuts to each of those fields up at the top. So again, it really comes down to personal preference. You can simply select this and then go down to the drop down, or alternatively, if you know what type of field you want immediately, you can go to that one and select it here and implement that directly into the form. Either way, you know, it all depends on your personal preference. However, one that is slightly unique and doesn't exist in the standard add a new field option here is add a new section. Okay, and this is a huge part of Infocapture, allowing us to divide the form into different sections, making it a bit easier to read and digest, I suppose. So to give, again, a bit more context, if we go to submit a ticket on the support ticket form here, we can see that we have this section here called reported details, another one called ticket details, and another one at the bottom called support team. Okay, now each of these are simply just the sections that you can apply to your form. It's just a nice way of breaking up everything, apologies, and allowing you to simply just divide that and make it, as I said, easier to read the overall sort of structure and layout of the form there. However, after that are, of course, the different fields that are there for the users to potentially fill in and sort of interact with. So the first thing we have here is what's called the text field. And you'll notice that some of these shortcut options on the right-hand side of them have this drop down. And what this is going to allow us to do is simply select a particular option of those. So for instance, with the text fields, all of these are a singular line text string, okay? And it's going to allow you to type in some characters to give maybe a person's name, email address, something along those lines. But what you'll notice, of course, is there's 3 varying lengths. So all of these are still going to be a singular text line. They won't be bigger than that, but of course they are just certain widths of that text length. So you have a short one, which is potentially quite useful for just a numerical or a small numerical value. Medium strings are a very good fit for a person's, full name or an email address as mentioned. And a long string might be a quite short, but a description of something that might be occurring within a particular issue of the form. To the right of that, we have the text area. And again, this comes in short, medium, and long, but also the additional BB code text, which I'll explain in a second. But once more, the intention of this field is going to be for a larger potential sentence or paragraph's worth of content. And this simply means that, of course, that when it comes to putting descriptions in your forms or reasons or explanations, these fields will be a lot more beneficial than a text field or a singular text string, if you will. Again, just increasing in size based on however much info you want. So as I said, a short string might be quite useful for a sentence or two. Medium would say a sort of small paragraph, and a long text will allow you to write a bit more again in regards to that. The last option we have here is the BB code. And this is very similar. It's the exact in terms of sizing as the long text, but the difference between these two is if I add one of these very quickly, I'll go over what I'm doing when it comes to actually building the form, but just to show the BB code. So again, this is pretty much the size of the large text area as well, and you can type whatever you want, but the uniqueness of the BB code, as we can see over on this part, is specifying that you can attach files, so screenshots, documents, etc., directly into the text field by simply dragging and dropping it, okay? And that's going to allow you, as I said, to add a screenshot or some other things to give you a bit more of a fuller description, depending on the nature of the form, I suppose. So it can be quite useful. For the purpose of this, we're not necessarily going to be using one, but I just wanted to show you the real difference there. So I'm going to just hit delete, get rid of that one here. Okay. Next is the checkbox. And then this has, of course, a singular checkbox or multiple. And this is going to simply allow you to put, as you'd expect, just a little box which you can tick. It can be useful for confirmations, I confirm that this is working or anything like that. Or alternatively, the multiple checkbox will allow you to have a variety of different options and to select from those options for preferences, I suppose. To the right of that, we have the radio buttons, which is similar to the checkboxes, of course. You apply a variety of different values to each of those checkboxes or radio buttons in this case. Of course, as you would expect, checkboxes allows you to pick multiple of those, whereas the radio buttons simply limit you to selecting one of those values that are available. Quite useful for when defining, again, the situation, what has occurred, and you have a variety of options to choose from. This can be very beneficial there. Next to that is the select field, which has, again, 2 options, either select or multiple select. And I suppose the best way to describe either of these is a standard select is just radio buttons and multiple select is multiple checkboxes, but of course visually different. So instead of it being those radio buttons you pick from the options or checkboxes and you pick from the options, the select field is of course just a drop-down text field. You type in all the different values exactly as you would with the other two, and then if it's a singular select, you pick from one of those options, and if it's multiple, you pick from a multitude of those, of course. We then have the date field. This again has multiple options available to us. We have either a standard date field, which will allow you to just, of course, open up a sort of a calendar view, I guess, and then select, of course, the day, month, and year of what's occurred. We have the date drop-down. It can be very useful for applying sort of days of births. It has these three separate fields where you can apply, of course, your day or month, and then month or day and year, allowing you, of course, to put these as separate sort of numerical values in there. And then the last one there is the date and time field. And in terms of visibility, or how it visually looks, should I say, it's exactly the same as the date field, but onto the right of that, it will also have a little timestamp. So if you need to specify not only when something occurred, but be a lot more specific on the exact time that that situation occurred, etc., you can utilize the date and time field for that, specific nature. The next one after that, sorry, is the financial field. And what this will allow you to simply do is, it's very similar in terms of display and potentially functionality as the simple short string. It's a field where you would put numerical values in. And again, ideally, these are going to be used for financial reasons, hence the financial field. You could utilize simply, as I said, just a small text string for that. But the major difference between the two is something we'll see in a future session of Infocapture is the ability to implement what are called like calculations. So you can, of course, have like different additions or maths sums, I guess, within an Infocapture form that you build, as long as you have the correct sort of calculations applied to the form. And what that will simply mean, of course, is that you can add stuff together, you can divide stuff, etc. And that can be very useful from a financial perspective. But the problem is, of course, just using the simple short string there is it doesn't have any sort of limiters on it. So if you were to divide a complex number, I suppose, naturally you might have seen that multiple decimal points, of course, can occur on something like that, which from a financial standpoint isn't very accurate or doesn't look particularly nice. So the financial field, although very similar in initial functionality, does round to 2 decimal places, making it a lot more presentable for a financial perspective and standpoint in that regard. Other than that, though, realistically, it is a very similar field. It is just nicely utilized for that sort of perspective and feature there. Next to that, then, we have our label and notice, and I pair these together purely because they have a very similar function. And what these fields allow you to do is, as the form builder, apply information or data to the users without a follow-on field. So, of course, with the other fields that we've seen, we would give the field a name, and then there would be a text box or a checkbox or anything for the user to fill in. The label and notice are purely there for you as the form constructor to give some additional information to the users and inform them of certain events, or reminding them, I suppose, of filling out all of the appropriate fields, etc. Stuff like that can be utilized within the form. Now, the label is something that visually will always be applied to the right-hand side of your form, sort of sticking out, I suppose, like a label would. And then the notice, however, is more of a robust field that can be implemented anywhere in the form. So your labels will always stick to the side, and a notice can be implemented, following a particular already added field, or just at the top of a section, or something along those lines. So that's really the only difference between these two. Their functionality is effectively the same, but just allowing for that feature there. Next, we have our user list. And again, this can be either a single select or multiple user select. And this, in terms of display and initial functionality, is quite similar to the select field. But instead of you typing out your own values, which you would do for the select field, so like select would be very useful for department, where you would type in each of those departments, etc. The user list will allow you to pull through from the people application and any staff that you have added on there, be it through groups or roles that you might have created from the admin side. You can specify those groups, those individuals, anything along those lines, and then they will automatically be added to this form. Okay, which can be very useful for something like a manager field, which, spoiler alert, something we're going to add to this form in a bit. But realistically, it's a very nice field for implementing that sort of information. Next to that, we have our documents and files. So this field simply allows you, again, to potentially put some file uploads or attachments within the form. The difference between the document and file, first off, file allows you to upload from your own local machine, your own hard drive. Basically, you can add any documents or screenshots that you might have, you wish to attach to the form. Whereas the document, again, is linking within Claromentis already. So the document management application that exists here, any documents that might have been stored in there, you can link to this form by utilizing the document option instead of files there. Next to that, we have the HTML field. And this will allow, simply put, sorry, Michelle, thank you very much for just questioning that. Yes, that is correct. So the intention would be with the file option. Just to clarify, if anyone missed that chat, it's that the ticket submitter can attach the files and not the admin creating the form. So a very good point. Yes, the intention there is for having the end user, the user filling out the form, to be able to add their own attachments or screenshots as necessary. So sorry, the HTML file field here, sorry, is realistically something that does allow you to implement some HTML text and information like that. But realistically, the best way to utilize a field like this is just to have an even larger and more in-depth text field. Okay, so this is what's going to be presented with you. Again, you can see it has the functionality to put different features, you know, radio buttons, etc. along those buttons. Bullet points, that's the one I was thinking of. You can implement some HTML by using the source option here, but realistically, this again is just potentially utilized as a larger in-depth text field for your users to fill out if you need something a bit more in-depth there. Okay. Next, we have the signature pad, and this will allow you to implement a digital signature on the form, allowing for, again, signing off or confirmation of a particular stage or status within the form. You can have your managers sign that or something along those lines. Can be very useful in regards to sort of implementing that information. As I said, very useful for sort of approvals and workflow confirmations. And then the last two fields that we have on here are the group and role, again, linked together realistically. And what these fields will allow you to do is represent and pull through the different groups from, again, your people application. So any system groups or any roles that you've added into the form, into the people application, sorry, can then be linked or shown or displayed within the form, depending on the option that you use here. And then the last option here is just called show fields as a table. Now, this isn't a functionality that, you know, interacts with the front end of the form in any way, shape or form. It's just as an administrator or a form builder, I suppose, to be able to visualize the form in a different way, of course, as a table. Now, if I select that right now, there isn't going to be too much of a difference because, of course, we don't have any fields on the form. But it will just simply show you, of course, the name, the symbolic name of the field, the type, if it's disabled, etc. But you'll also notice at this point that we can export and import a CSV here as well, which can be very useful for creating a variety of different, speeding up some steps within creating a form. So if there's a lot of repetition, if there's a section that utilizes the same sort of fields over and over again, you can potentially export that as a CSV, then copy and paste those fields into the form multiple times and then import that once more, allowing for a bit of a speedier process for, as I said, a lot of repetition in regards to that. If all of the fields are going to be slightly unique and not necessarily following that repetitive format, to be honest, it's probably easier just building the form manually. But certainly if they're quite large, etc., it can be quite useful to use this import method here. But I'm just going to go back to viewing as a form. And what we're going to do now is actually look at building this form. So enough waffling on, I suppose. And I'm going to start with a couple of sections. So the first thing here is going to be user info. Okay, let's put details. So for a section, there isn't too much configuration you can do here. You can define whether or not you want this header to actually be visible, or if it's simply just a way as the form builder to be able to break this up and see the different sections for yourself. Normally, I would strongly recommend doing this purely from a display standpoint. These section headers can be very nice, but you know, it is up to you. You can also configure the position. So if there is already more than one existing field on here, you can select a position and move it to a different location. And again, if you're using the system style sheets, you can utilize CSS here to change maybe the background or the color of the font, etc., within the section itself. Now we can see there's also this additional tab up at the top. And what this will allow us to do is give a particular description to this if necessary. Something like that. And then if I just hit save, okay, we can see here is our section, and here's the little description that will appear based on what I've typed there. If I choose not to have a description, like so, then this will just fill out the entire line, you should expect. Now that description section, just to clarify, that's exactly what a label would look like as well, just as a visual sort of reference, so you'll know what that would ideally look like. It will pin to the right-hand side and allow you to put some additional information in there. Now with that done, let's put a couple of text fields. So let's start with a medium string, which we're going to call name. So it's important to see that, of course, excluding the sections, these standard fields have a bit of information going on, or a lot of features that need to be sort of applied here. So the first thing we have, of course, is just the name of the field, what it's going to be called, what the end users will see that this field is called, etc. But underneath that, we then have the symbolic name. Now, this is a very important aspect of the Infocapture tool, as this is what the database, etc., references. So it won't look at the standard name, it will look at the symbolic name. But as you'll notice at this point, is if I select into the name, the symbolic name there, or if I just moved away from name, it will automatically generate the symbolic name based on what the name field specifies. It will achieve all of the sort of logic and rules that are required for a symbolic name. For instance, this is lowercase. If there was a space in here in a different word, there would be an underscore attaching these two, as there can't be spaces in a symbolic name, for instance. But it will take care of all of that, and you won't realistically have to change the symbolic name at all. There are a small use cases, I suppose, where you would have to change the symbolic name. We'll actually see one of those as we build the form, but realistically, 9 times out of 10, you will not have to adjust the symbolic name in any way, just to make you aware of that. So that's absolutely fine. We then have the optional hints. And this is simply just going to put a little question mark, which you can then mouse over, an additional tooltip, if you will, for the field in question. So if the field is quite ambiguous, I suppose, there hasn't been given a lot of context in its actual name, you can choose to put an optional hint, like so. Now, this is obviously quite straightforward. Probably ideally wouldn't want to put an optional hint for a field that's asking for a user's name. So we will remove that for now, but of course you can add those as necessary. We then have the type. And as mentioned, at the moment we can see that this says medium string, but exactly like if we were just to press add field there, we always have the option to move this and correct this or adjust it to a different type of field at any point. So let's say, for instance, although I selected medium string, I actually meant medium text. Instead of having to delete this entire field and then adding a new one, I can just adjust it from here as necessary. I picked the right one, fortunately, at this point, so I don't need to change that, but this will always be useful and available to you if necessary. We then have the string format, which is purely unique for any of the text string ones, so either medium, short, small, or large, but it's an option here to define how the formatting of this field should be registered. And we can see there's 4 options here. So there is text, integer, floating point, and email. Now, again, very similar to the symbolic name, 9 times out of 10, you will never really have to change this from text. Text is what's considered alphanumeric, so you can put words in there, you can put numbers, you can put letters, you can put anything, and the field will be absolutely happy with that, okay? It's only if you need to be very specific and you need to put some limitations on there where you would potentially look at adjusting to the integer, floating point, etc. So for instance, the integer simply requires and will not submit if you haven't just put a number in there. Likewise with floating point, if you haven't put a numeric with a decimal place in there, the form literally can't be submitted. It will say incorrect field formatting to that particular field, and then you'll have to re-input that information correctly. As I said, with a text field, it will allow anything. It's totally fine, but that can be very useful for specifics. The email option, again, requires you to put an email address in there. And this can also be utilized if you select the email option for notifications in the future. We won't do it for this one, but we'll see it on the next field that we could potentially utilize that if necessary. So I'm just going to say text, that's fine. Again, that is the default. You don't have to sort of tweak that 99% of the time. But in certain situations, you may want to adjust that appropriately. And then underneath that, we then have our default value. And this is simply just going to allow us to type in something here, like so. And what this will simply mean is whatever's been specified will automatically appear every time someone submits a new ticket. So when they come to fill out the form, they will see that this has been automatically applied, and they'll always see enter your name here. This can be very useful, again, for sort of giving some additional context, similar to the optional hint, I suppose. But it's worth mentioning that this can be considered what you would call, I suppose, a double-edged sword. Because if you enter a default value like so, and then also specify that the field is required, as far as the form is concerned, that has technically been filled out, okay? Although you haven't changed the wording or anything like that, the form will look at this and go, yeah, there's text in there, it's been filled, you know, the requirement has been achieved, let's submit it. So that is something, if you're planning on requiring it, don't often, at least, put a default value in there, but there are certain situations where it might be beneficial. And that, in this case, is when utilizing the existing variables, okay? And what this will allow you to do is, you might have seen when I selected this and seen a variety of different options, it allows you to put some script from the people application directly into the form. So again, we can see there's a couple of options, and realistically, I could put something like user first name, and then go to the drop down again and put user surname, okay? And what this is basically saying is, now that's been added to the default value, every time a user comes to submit a new ticket, it's going to look at their profile, it's going to see what's been put into their first name field in their profile and their surname or last name field on their profile. And then it's simply going to pull that data through and automatically apply their name to this field. Okay, which can be very useful, of course, of just getting that data straight away. As long as that's been added to the person's profile, then you can add that and see that automatically within the form here. Which will then, of course, allow you to potentially have this required because they don't have to change it, or alternatively, you can disable the field, meaning that people can't interact with it. You're just specifying, pulling through their name and their information, and then simply leaving it as that and saying, there you go, we put your name on here, you can't change it effectively. There is also an additional option in here, which is to reload the form on changing. This is very important for advanced rules and functionality in the form. Because of the process or the functionality of this field, we don't need to utilize that, but we'll see that being implemented going forward for some other fields. Now, before I hit save, very quickly, just want to go over these other options. So we have the CSS class allowing you to, of course, change the font color, etc. again. And then we have, of course, the label size, which increases the size of the actual field itself, potentially separating the cells of the input and the label, which is the name that I've typed, and the input is the part that the user will fill out. I can put the label above the input. So as we'll see in a second, they normally reside left to right, but we can put them above one another. And also grouping with next, which is an important factor we'll see in a second. Another item here is constraints. This is going to allow us to basically specify that this field must equal a certain word, for instance, or it needs to be more than a certain amount of characters, or number, a certain number, for instance. Something like that you can implement with the constraints here. But for now, I'm just going to hit save. Done. Okay. So there we go. Can't edit this, can't interact with it, but ideally that's going to pull through that user's information when they submit a ticket. I'm going to put another medium string on here now. Call this email. And of course, these will go a bit quicker now. We've given a bit more context to some of the options here. Let's go to this once more, and we're going to say user email address. Let's disable this one again and hit save. Now, something I want to bring to your attention, of course, you can see every time you add a new field to the form, they will always be listed underneath one another on separate rows, if you will. If you want to group them and put more than one field per row, you need to utilize on an existing one, say, for instance, with this name on here, as we saw a second ago, if I go back to the style and this option here to group with next. That means that the next field that we add to the form will then be grouped and listed on the same row. So if I hit save now, email has been upped onto that row and I'll put them in sort of a long alignment, if you will. So that's something to be aware of, again, in terms of sort of spacing out, adding stuff like this. Realistically, you can potentially fit about 3 medium strings per row. Ideally, you wouldn't want to go further than that, as it can compress the form too much, making it look quite strange. Naturally, if it's like date fields, you can maybe put a bit more on there, but always be sort of careful with how much you want to add to a row here. Okay. Next, I am going to put a select field, and we're going to call this department. Now, with this one, of course, you've got the optional hint still. You can change this from a different type, but we have what's called our values in reference to this. And what the values will allow us to do is simply define what option should appear in this dropdown. So we might say something like marketing. Okay, apparently I can't think of any other departments right now, so we'll leave it as that. Okay, and then there's this option here to use advanced UI if necessary, and the default value option where we can say it will automatically rest on one of these options here. But at the moment, you can see that this doesn't allow me to select from the values I've added. And in fact, what we need to do realistically before anything is commit these options, if you will, to the database. And to do that, we need to quickly press save. Now, unlike with those text fields, this pop-up is still going to exist, and we can see that each of the values here has been defined a reference number now. This will in turn allow us to find a particular default value, but alternatively, we can select this option to mean that please select will be considered the default, meaning if we make this field required, we'll have the option to, it'll demand us to select one of these options in regards to that. I'm not going to disable this. The advanced UI is certainly something you can utilize in some situations, which I'll showcase in a second. But for now, we're just going to do this. We're also going to make this have some functionality in a future session. So I'm going to reload this form on changing. Style, pretty much all exactly the same as we can see. I'm going to group this with next, and I'm not going to change it in constraints. We're going to hit save here. Okay. So there's our department field. Those are the options to select from. And as mentioned, this will now sort of reload the form on changing, making certain abilities or functionality occur based on any rules that I create within the admin side of Infocapture. Now with this, on top of this here, as I mentioned, there is also this advanced UI option. So this can be very useful. As we can see from the sort of display here, this is going to show us all of the options available in this sort of drop-down display. Now, if you have, obviously we've only got 4 options to choose from there, but if you say had hundreds, this can obviously be quite tedious to try and pick the appropriate one. So what we can alternatively use is the advanced UI here. Save that. Okay, and this will allow us, of course, to then see the drop down once more, but also type in the specific one that we're looking for. Okay, just making it a bit easier to navigate if you do have a large amount of options of values in this field. Okay, but we don't need that for now, so we'll go back to that. The next option we are going to do is have a user list. This is going to be a singular select, and we are going to put manager in here. Perfect. Optional hint, no need. And once more, we need to commit this field to the database in order to be able to create some functionality. Again, there's no value option on this one, and we can't specify any default values. In fact, what will happen is if we press save, then this edit selectable users option will appear. And if I open up that, an additional pop-up will appear. And this is going to allow me to specify, as I mentioned, from the people application, what users should appear within this dropdown. So if I, for instance, typed in all registered, thinking about it, perfect. Apply those permissions there and hit save. You'll see that that now consists of everyone who's on the stored within the people application, if you will. And that means I can choose from all of those people. Again, this has an advanced UI. So if there's quite a large amount to choose from, you can select that option, and it means you have to type in the user's name instead. Okay. But for the purpose of this, I'm not going to do that. And in fact, I'm going to disable this field. And what we're going to do in a future session is we're going to basically configure it. So when you select a particular department, say marketing, it will automatically populate this manager field with the appropriate manager from for that department. Okay, so that's something to look forward to, I suppose, in a future webinar. But just to let you know, that's something that we'll be setting up for the future there, and that's what the reload form on changing will allow us to do. Okay, so there's our user details. Let's create another section. We're getting on. Apologies for the time there, and let's call this issue details. Save. Okay, so this section is all going to be about, the issues that are occurring within the item itself. So for instance, let's start with a radio button here. Okay, let's say I can't think of anything else, so let's put other in here as well. And again, we're going to specify no default value here. In order to make this work, once more, we do have to commit it for default values. But that's fine right now. And again, I'm going to make this reload the form on changing for functionality that we're not yet to see. But I'm going to hit that, press save. And that is going to generate a these options for us. Of course, commit these to the database as mentioned. And now we can see the radio buttons here. Now, something unique to this and the multiple checkboxes is we can see, of course, that the display is on a sort of horizontal layout here. If I go into this and go to the style, as I mentioned, completely unique to both this and the multiple checkboxes, there's this additional option here called horizontal layout, which has been selected. If I untick that and then hit save again, you'll see that these now go in a vertical order instead, allowing us to sort of structure that as necessary. It's purely, of course, just cosmetic. Whichever way is more preferential for you, absolutely select, but it just lays that out in a certain way for you. What I'm going to do in reference to this is I am going to put another text field on here, called a medium string, and let's say, please describe. Okay. And hit save. Okay, so there we go. And again, just to give you context of what we'll be doing in the future for this then, is that intentionally this please describe field will be completely invisible and you will not see it at all unless you select other from these type of issue options, allowing you to elaborate on exactly what that issue might be. Whereas the other ones, of course, are going to be definitive. Other, of course, is vague. It's going to allow you to type that. And as I said, this will only appear based on the other selection being made. Email, monitor, and hard drive, and this won't show up. Now we are going to put a long text on here. Let's just call this description issue. Better. Again, we could usually make this required, probably would be recommended, just for the purpose of now, though I'm not going to. And now I'm just going to hit save. So very similar in terms of functionality as the text strings, the text fields or text areas. You can still use existing variables, etc. But it is, as I mentioned, just a larger version of that type of field. With that said, okay, we're going to add a couple of other options on here. So the next one is for adding some attachments and screenshots onto this. So we are going to add the file option here. Let's call this file upload, symbolic name, perfect. There isn't too much more to this type of field. Of course, we can put style in here, and I am in fact going to group something with next for this. But there we go. Again, you can make this required if necessary, but for the purpose of now, I'm just going to hit save. Okay, so that's what this will look like. And again, it will allow an end user to add their own screenshot, etc., to this if necessary. I'm also going to add a checkbox onto this. And let's call this additional. Yes, sorry, apologies. I know this is slightly overrunning. I'm only going to put a couple of other fields onto this form. Hopefully we can see how this looks. But I just want to complete this in regards to all the type of fields that you might want to add to something like this. Okay, so there we go. And again, I'm going to make this have the functionality to reload the form on changing. And I'm just going to hit save very quickly. Done. Okay, so that's our file upload. Push it along a bit. Perfect. Looks a bit nicer now. And then I'm just going to add for the form one last file upload. And the reason I've done this is I just wanted to showcase something I mentioned at the start, and that's tied to these symbolic names. So as I said, 9 times out of 10, these aren't something that you will have to change. There is only a situation or a circumstance in which the symbolic name needs to change, and that's when you're going to have duplicately named fields. So of course, we have a file upload field on here, but realistically, we don't want to call this a different name. This is also going to be called file upload, which in turn will, of course, give it the exact same symbolic name. And this is something that the system doesn't like, really. And in fact, it's impossible to implement. Because that symbolic name is how the fields are identified and referenced on the database, you can't have any duplicates for the same form. Just to clarify, like you can for different forms. So you could have another symbolic name called file upload in another form that you've created. But for this one specifically, each of the symbolic names have to be completely unique. So that's something that you need to bear in mind. And realistically, the best way to counter that is simply, as we can see here with these suggestions, is just to put a number after it, something like that. You don't necessarily have to change it hugely. It just needs to be completely, slightly unique to the other fields that have those same names. Something to be aware of course, if you're building quite a large form, and you completely forget there's already a field named something like that up at the top or closer, another part of the form, it will alert you to this. So as we can see, if I just leave this as file upload and hit save, it's actually going to alert us to say that this already existed, and it in fact will already correct it for us, putting that one after that. So giving that a unique function, it's just notifying us and alerting us that that has happened. But just something to be aware of, that you can adjust this preemptively so you won't get this alert, and these do have to be unique from one another. Okay, so I am now going to hit save because that is now unique. We can add that there. And again, the intention of this, just to let you know, is what we're going to do is hide this second file upload field, and that is only going to appear based on if you've selected additional upload or not.
I just wanted to quickly mention something about symbolic name and editing it. That whilst you can edit them when you create the form, it's really not advised to edit the symbolic name once a form has already been published and used, because that could potentially break any logic that you will attach, probably as Michael will demonstrate in future sessions. But yeah, I just wanted to point it out to avoid any future issues.
Thank you, Gilly. Yes, that's a very good point, in fact. So I really appreciate that. Exactly as Gilly's mentioned, like with the idea of, as I said, like, financial or equations that you can add to a form for like what that will allow you to do is it works off the symbolic names again. So if you do choose to change a symbolic name from another field in the future, that calculation, for instance, will no longer work because it doesn't have that reference and things like that. So exactly that. You want to potentially be set on those symbolic names before you truly commit to making future changes and adjustments to the form. But perfect.
Just to jump on the back of that as well, we do have an improvement coming out soon that does protect those options somewhat. There's like an acknowledgement barrier that we're adding now to make it a bit more clear that that is the consequence of changing that field.
Ooh, thank you, Elliot. Elliot, they're one of our developers. Appreciate that. It's always good to know. But yes, fantastic. Hugh, you've asked a question there very quickly. Is a separate database created for each form or project? Good question. I don't know if it's necessarily a separate database. It's just archived separately. Potentially one of the someone else be able to answer that a bit clearer for me. But I don't think it's necessarily a separate database as such.
Yeah, the data won't be stored on a separate database. It will be still within Claromentis database. So yeah.
Fantastic.
If you need to extract things out, there's some reporting functionality that you can export everything into CSV file, things like that.
Perfect. Okay. So of course, this is quite a straightforward form. I just utilized a variety of the different fields available to us. But simply put, that's pretty much how we would piece one together. Once we're happy with the sort of construction, we can simply then just hit check in form. And that's going to allow us to then set that to stone, if you will. Of course, at this point, it's going to give us a couple of suggestions or information to add as well. First thing it's going to ask is for a version comment. And this can be very useful from a collaborative standpoint. If multiple people are working on this form, every time that you check in the form or make a new version of it effectively, you can specify what changes you've made and adjustments you've made, so other people who would then work on this in the future can see or read up on basically what changes you've adjusted. Underneath that, there is also the option to define how to use this version. And then certainly at this point, this has no real impact or play on the form, as this is a brand new form. But as time sort of progresses and you start building more and more versions and making more and more changes, these can have a bit more of an impact on how the form will react going forward. So we can see there are three options to choose from. Only for new tickets, replace the previous version with this one, and replace all previous versions with this one. And it simply just means that based on new changes, adjustments to the version you've made, how is the form going to react for previous submissions? So for instance, if we select only for new ticket, it means that from this point onwards, if we've added a new section or fields or anything, they will only appear for tickets starting now. Anything in the past will remain exactly as they were. There won't be any changes to those. Alternatively, if you select replace the previous version, let's say this was version 7 of the form, version 6 or any tickets submitted on version 6 will also have those changes applied, and replace all previous versions means that every single ticket from the dawn of time, I guess, will have those changes implemented onto them as well. So of course, this can not necessarily cause a huge impact, but can certainly give a lot of additional fields where they might not necessarily be needed on older submissions, etc. So bear in mind that this can have an impact for future versions of your form. But again, because this is brand new, literally doesn't matter. So I'll leave it on that one, just hit save. Okay, so that's now our form created and done. There are, of course, a couple of other options on there that we need to sort of apply, like the permissions to allow people to view that. But realistically, in terms of piecing and building a form together, that's all that's needed there. Okay, so sorry again for running a little bit late there. Tend to waffle when it comes to Infocapture, as you can probably tell. But hopefully that has given a bit of insight of how we can build a form, potentially give you some insight of maybe how you would construct one yourself. Are there any additional questions before we end the webinar today? Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, looks good. So as mentioned, So that's a good question there, Tony, very quickly. That's actually tied to the permissions. So as you might have seen, of course, I've added those file attachment fields, but if you're actually going from the front end, that was perfect where I want it to be. Let's go back. There's this option at the moment called add file, which is separate. It's not a field that you add to the form. It's a unique thing, and that's purely tied to the permissions of the form. So although we won't go into this in too much detail now, I just quickly want to run over the rights of the project permissions. And you can see there's this option called attach files to a ticket. So that will, as you exactly mentioned there, have a default option to attach documentation. But you need to make sure the permissions are in place in order to do that. But ultimately, yes, that is possible. Okay. Within that form, Hugh, so so if you do have another form of a similar sort of structure, and it also has a file upload field, the separate form, that can be called file upload. It doesn't need to be file upload 1, 2, etc. It's only when you're building multiple of the same field and the same symbolic name in one particular form. It can string across multiple ones. It's just it needs to be localized and different and unique, should I say, sorry, for the form that you're constructing there. No worries. Okay. Perfect. Well, I guess, as I said, I've taken enough of your time already, guys, so I really appreciate that. I have recorded this session, as mentioned, so we'll be adding it to Discover shortly, allowing you to go through this as necessary. I believe that we're going to start a small sort of suite of these. So the next webinar that we're going to create is going to continue on from here and allow us to sort of further advance this particular form. As I said, we'll be looking at the permissions, the ability to add advanced rules, etc. But for the meantime, as I said, thank you so much for your time. I hope it has proved useful, and I will be looking forward to seeing some of your friendly faces. Well, names, I guess, not faces, in the future. But again, thank you so much, and have a lovely rest of the day.